Welcome to Chapter 10 of Understanding Human Development. We're on adolescence and emergent adulthood. In this chapter, we're going to look at the cultural context of adolescence, and we're going to look at some physical changes and how adolescents relate to that. We're also going to look at how cultural attitudes about sex have changed over time and how education can have an impact on teen sex. Lastly, we're also going to look at brain development and how some cognitive activities are common in adolescence. Okay, so adolescence is that period of time that's a transition between childhood and adulthood, and it can extend for a decade or more, depending on the culture. In today's culture, what defines the beginning and end point of adolescence? In the United States, adolescence is typically associated with high school, but that's because of our emphasis on compulsory secondary education. That's not necessarily the case around the world. So typically adolescence is associated with puberty in many other places. So in less industrialized countries, the transition from childhood to adolescence typically begins when children enter their reproductive years, which is usually marked by a symbolic event or transitional ritual called rites of passage. So those reproductive years are marked by puberty, essentially. So the transitional period is a transitional period in which individuals typically plan for their adult lives, and adolescents are particularly sensitive to the world around them. And so that's because they're smart. We typically underestimate how smart adolescents are and how engaged in the world they are. That's evident by how teens have been activists after school shootings and about climate change and things like that. And now, attempts to understand adolescence still must be considered in their broader social context. They do not exist in a vacuum. There are three main periods of adolescence and emergent adulthood, and that is early adolescence, later adolescence, and emergent adulthood. And we're going to look at the differences in those. Many scholars today refer to the period between the end of adolescence, which is defined as the end of high school in the United States, and the adoption of adult roles and responsibilities as emergent adulthood. So this is typically like the college age, ages between 18 and 25. After that, once they get out of that transitional period and they take on adult responsibilities or adulting, then they're really adults. And so adolescence is often defined into those three periods. Early adolescence, you might think of as ages 10 to 14. That would be upper middle school or junior high or the freshman year of high school. Later adolescence would correspond to the upper class or senior high, basically, from at least sophomore year to senior year of high school. And emergent adulthood, as I said, is about the college. These are college age kids. They're typically 18 to 25. Now, in other countries, in countries where there's less emphasis on education and things like that, or higher education and more emphasis on kids going out and becoming adults, they may not have this transitional period of being an emergent adult. And they might just go right into being a young adult. But typically, young adults are different from emergent adults in the sense that they already are responsible for themselves, and they pay their own, they earn their own living basically, and they take care of themselves. They're not dependent on other people. So that would be a young adult instead of an emergent adult. Emergent adult is basically someone who's still technically an adolescent in every other way except for age. Okay, now in the United States, the period of adolescence is heavily segregated by age. Teenagers generally spend more time with peers of their age than with younger children or adults. So they're very segregated by age. Now, other people, they do not care as much, but adolescents want to hang out with people of their own age group. Now, this can have its advantages. Well, ideally they learn how to socialize with other kids. The downside, of course, is that it deprives adolescents opportunities to guide and tutor younger children, And separation from older adults in the adult world means that they're missing out on opportunities for guidance and mentoring from older people. So that's the downside about this age segregation. Economic dependence is another characteristic of adolescence that's found in the U.S. culture because teenagers are usually financially dependent on their parents during these years of schooling. This situation typically leads to some frustration and restlessness. Parents are their primary means of support. And so if they want to become, ideally, they want to have their sense of independence and autonomy, and yet they're still dependent on their parents. In some ways, it's good because they haven't developed the maturity yet in some ways to be out on their own many times. This can oftentimes result in conflict between parents and their teenage children. Okay, so in adolescence, will develop, they're engaged in the world, so they may develop strong opinions about the world around them. And so adolescents in the United States are often deeply affected by the events of their time in which they live. And many adolescents are heavily influenced by the mass media. They're especially vulnerable to crises such as wars, religious movements, and economic ups and downs. And as I said, they're particularly vulnerable to the passive role of being a mass media consumer because of and they're particularly influenced by social media. Now, we mentioned adolescence and also emergent adulthood. Emergent adulthood is different from adolescence they're different, but they're also similar. They're similar to adolescence in that there's still an emphasis on identity exploration. But yet, while they're supposed to be they're oftentimes expected to become adults, and yet this is still a big time of instability. Emergent adults are still moving back and forth, oftentimes between their parents and school, or they're still moving around trying to establish themselves. Emergent adults are similar to adolescents in the sense that they are still focused on themselves. They haven't developed the broader view of looking at other people and understanding their place in the world and paying attention to other people. So if you're in a relationship with an emergent adult, it's not necessarily if you are older, that you may not like it because an emergent adult is basically focused on their survival. Now, we don't want to shame them for that because this is an important transition in their lives as they are trying to figure out themselves. And so it is necessary sometimes for emergent adults to focus on themselves because that's what they need to do. They need to figure out what their life is going to be about. They need to figure out what their identity is going to be, and they need to establish some stability and figure out what their jobs are going to be. Oftentimes, emergent adults feel like they're in between. They're not quite youth, and they're not quite adolescents, and they're not quite adults. And so they may feel like they don't have a place of their own. As I've talked about with my own church ministry context, oftentimes, they want to hang out with high school youth even more than older young adults. They might be classified as young adults, but they don't resonate with the other young adults because they're still not quite there yet. Older young adults, and that would be like kids between 25 and 35, or I shouldn't say kids, but adults between 25 and 35. They're young still, but they are different from emergent adults because young adults, they're adults and they're out working already. They got their jobs. They may be married and having kids already. Whereas college students and emergent adults still haven't quite figured it out yet, and so they may not be able to relate to other young adults. On the other hand, emergent adults are in an age of possibilities. They got the world ahead of them. They're excited about the future, and they're exploring all their options. And so it's an exciting time in some ways. So it's the age of possibilities. So let's talk about the physical development that happens in adolescence. Adolescence is marked by rapid physical changes, and these are largely controlled by the increased production of hormones. Adolescence ranks with the fetal period and infancy as a time of rapid biological change. And unfortunately, reconciling the differences between the real and the ideal sometimes is challenging. Sometimes people want to, have these ideals, and yet they may not always be there. So how parents react to their child's physical changes can have a profound impact on their development. So as I said, there's oftentimes increased growth due to their hormones, which are biochemical substances that are secreted into the bloodstream in very tiny amounts by the internal organs. And so those are hormones. And the increase in the rate of growth, and so adolescence has, like I said, an increase in rate of growth. There's a rapid development of reproductive organs and appearance of secondary sex characteristics. Some developmental trends are the same for boys and girls, and some are different. And like I said, physical changes are largely controlled by hormones, and we're going to look at some of those in a minute. But during this time, adolescents experience what is known as the adolescent growth spurt. So that's what it's called. And changes in hormones these changes cause the adolescent growth spurt, which is a period of rapid growth in physical size and strength, accompanied by changes in body proportion, which is followed about a year later by puberty. So the growth spurt can start before puberty. Adolescents are often preoccupied with these changes, and they compare themselves to others and to their idealized images of how they wish to be. Especially if others are ahead of them, or the media says or depicts adolescents a certain way. And the reality is, unfortunately, a lot of adolescents depicted in the movies are actually being played by older adults or young adults, and so it may give the impression that adolescents are supposed to appear bigger than they actually are. So secondary sex characteristics develop in early adolescence, as do the reproductive organs. And secondary sex characteristics are those parts of our body that are not directly related to reproduction, but they are still sex differences, basically. So, for example, the development of breast are considered secondary sex characteristics. Okay, so here's a chart that illustrates the differences in growth rates and sexual development during puberty. As you can see on the top, those are the chart. The top of the chart in red illustrates the puberty growth rate for girls, and on the bottom shows the growth rate for boys. So as you can see, girls start actually growing in their height earlier than boys. And in fact, between the ages of 10 and 12, girls can actually be taller than boys. And then boys will catch up and surpass them later, typically. And as you can see, girls will then start to develop breast and pubic hair, and then they will have their first period, which is known as menarche. Boys will start the development of their testes and their pubic hair. Their height spurt, or growth spurt in height, will start and end a little later than their puberty actually starts, whereas for girls, their growth spurt actually starts a little earlier than boys. And as you can see, the pubic hair tends to come in last. The peak in the line labeled height spurt represents the point of the most rapid growth. So, as you can see, there is a time in which they will grow really quickly, and then it starts to taper off. The bars below represent the average beginning and end of the events of puberty. So you can see at how puberty is defined typically for adolescents. So that's the chart that illustrates these growth rates. So although there is a widespread in age among both boys and girls with respect to when they reach physical maturity, girls mature on average about 2 years earlier than boys, as you can see. Okay, male and female hormones are present in members of both sexes. Males produce more of the hormones called androgens, and androgen comes from the word andros, which literally means male. So, of course, the most important of these is testosterone, as you've heard of that. Testosterone is an important hormone that makes boys, it contributes to the development of our puberty, but also can make, if you get too much of it, you can lead to more aggression and that sort of thing. Females produce more of the hormones called estrogens and progesterone. And the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland maintain the balance in the production of the hormones. The pituitary gland is what initiates the, the puberty process. It's considered the master gland in the endocrine system. It produces several varieties of hormones, and that's what helps get the puberty process started. So both male and female hormones are, like I said, are present in both sexes. And at adolescence, like I said, boys begin producing more of that androgen. So I think I covered all of that. Hormones basically have a powerful effect on the brain, influencing its development. And the emotionality often seen in teenagers results not only because of the hormone action, but also because of complex interaction of social, cultural, and environmental factors. Let's talk about puberty next. Well, we've talked about the growth rates, and we saw a chart about puberty, but let's talk more about it. So puberty is the attainment of sexual maturity in both males and females. So sexual maturity. So the sexual maturation occurs during adolescence. And puberty refers to that attainment and the ability to have children. So the ability to reproduce, essentially. In girls, puberty is marked by menarche, which usually occurs around ages 9.5 to 16.5. And the average age of menarche today in the United States is just under 12.5. In boys, puberty is marked by the first emission of semen with viable sperm cells. And this usually occurs between ages 11 and 16. Some people call this semenarche as a complement to menarche. So that usually occurs around ages 11 to 16. And again, that's starts a little later compared to what girls do. As you can see, here's some of the growth or changes in boys and girls. I'm not going to go into it too much in detail, but as you can see, in girls it starts with breast development, and in boys it starts with the growth of the testes and the scrotal sac. And toward the end, you can see, and then they both start to develop pubic hair, and toward the end there's the development of the menarche, the first period, and then for boys the first ejaculation of semen. And that can happen through wet dreams or something else. And so that's basically the main differences. And they're otherwise, for the most part, they look the same. As you can see, the physical changes are roughly about the same. Okay, so the secular trend is the average age of, it's how the average age of menarche varies around the world, and it's becoming earlier and earlier. So in many industrialized parts of the world, puberty occurs at younger ages now in the historical past, and so that's why it's called the secular trend. I have a feeling, and I couldn't find this, but I believe the name may have come out of some moralizing about, or the shaming about having earlier periods. But now we're starting to understand that earlier periods are not necessarily bad. It could actually be representation of good nutrition. So around the world, the age of menarche varies. The average girl in the Czech Republic has her first period at 14. In Kenya, it's 16. And in New Guinea, it's 18, which is pretty late if you think about it. But in other countries, it starts really young. In the prehistoric period, menarche probably occurred between the ages of 7 and 13. So actually, it's always been somewhat young. It's only probably due to poor nutrition or malnutrition or not having adequate body weight in which it's been delayed. So now that it's getting earlier, it could actually be going back to the way it was supposed to be, or the way it was always been. So the girls of average height usually reach menarche when they weigh about 100 pounds, but they usually do not ovulate until about a year later. So again, menarche, or their first period, starts when they weigh about 100 pounds, but they will not ovulate. And that means the production of eggs until about a year later. So they can't have children until after a year, about a year after they've started. Now, as I mentioned, we talked about the timing of menarche, and there's factors that influence the onset of this. That could be genes and environment, obesity, which is really going back to the body weight, and stress. The secular trend is related to generally nutrition and general health, although genetics probably is also involved, as there are more subtle environmental factors, and these affect the onset of puberty in general. Okay, so let's talk about body image. Adolescents belong to a marginal group, a group between cultures or on the fringe of a dominant culture. They typically exhibit an intensified need to conform with other adolescents, and adolescents can be very intolerant of deviations from the norm. They can bully and pick on others that are not fitting with the social norms. Mass media oftentimes contributes to this intolerance, and they may have extreme sensitivity at this stage, which can foster anxiety and a lot of self-doubt. Okay, so adolescents, like I said, are very concerned with their body image, and they engage in social comparisons, comparing their body shape to that of other teenagers into the idealized images of the perfect body. During middle childhood, children become aware of different body types and ideals, but in adolescence, social comparisons with their peers occur continuously. So their body type receives especially close attention. For boys, physical size and strength is of primary concern, and for girls, the worry tends to resolve around weight or being too tall, or being too fat or too tall. That's one of the common concerns for girls. Whereas for boys, it's about physical size and strength. However, both groups can suffer from eating disorders. Now, girls are more likely to have the eating disorders, but are also seeing an increase in boys having eating disorders as well. So during adolescence, young people can become absorbed with issues of body image. Healthy, balanced diets and appropriate exercise programs can have positive outcomes. But a preoccupation with body image can be destructive. And you can also have a preoccupation with healthy eating, as we were talking about. I call this orthorexia. However, for many people, obesity is an increasingly prevalent problem. More than 17% of U.S. teens are obese, which is problematic because this is setting the stage for health problems for the rest of one's life. However, many people have eating disorders, and it's not just about weight. Many people might be so focused on living healthy, but it's maybe turning into an eating disorder. So we have to be able to differentiate between something that is simply just trying to be healthy versus actually having eating disorder. Now, if we look at this is the prevalence rates of obesity. Between 1988 and 1994, as you can see, the prevalence of obesity is between about 13% to about 16%. But as you can see, between 2011 and 2014, the lowest percentage for any of these racial groups is still larger than the greatest percentage in the times before that. So as you can see, the amount of obesity has really increased dramatically to about 18 to 24%. About a quarter of teenagers are obese. And obesity is not just being overweight. We're talking about, a really unhealthy amount of weight. And as we said, that can contribute to lifelong health problems. Now, 3 different types of eating disorders. But basically, an extreme focus on weight can lead to obesity or to eating disorders, and the latter of which is more common among adolescent girls and boys. There are 3 different types of eating disorders, as I said. There's anorexia nervosa, there's bulimia nervosa, and there's binge eating disorder. Anorexia nervosa is an eating disorder in which a person is obsessed by thoughts of an unattainable image of thinness and eats very little food, which can result in death. Anorexia affects about 1% of teenage girls, but about 20% of those will die from complications. So even though it's rare, the problem is deadly. So if someone develops anorexia, they have a 1 in 5 chance of dying. That's really scary. So that's why it's such a problem. Even though it may affect only 1%, the mortality rate is very high. Now, another one is bulimia nervosa. This is an eating disorder characterized by binging and purging. And this affects about 1 to 2% of the U.S. women. And now this, even though they may have, they might actually look normal because their body weight may look the same as everybody else. The problem is that They may have an imbalance of electrolytes if they're purging a lot, and that could also kill. And it could create heart arrhythmias and stuff like that. Anorexia nervosa is also deadly because when you get a low amount of weight, it can also cause your heart to stop as well. So that's why, sometimes if someone's suffering from anorexia, they need to be put in a hospital just to make sure that they don't die. And so that's, these are very dangerous. Generally, girls have a lower satisfaction with their body image, which is why girls tend to have more eating disorders. Now, binge eating disorder involves recurrent episodes of binge eating in a short amount of time, and this affects about 3.5% of women in the United States. Now, this one, it doesn't have, it's not considered as, we don't think of it as deadly in the sense that it doesn't have immediate effects necessarily. It's not going to kill you overnight, but it will create long-term health problems that will be deadly. And, excess weight can also cause heart problems, cardiovascular problems as well. So in a sense, this is deadly. Maybe it's not right away, but it is still because it creates health complications. So why do some people develop eating disorders? As we mentioned, there's a culture of female thinness, a lot of emphasis on women being thin. Now, and from my understanding, this affects our racial groups differently. White girls seem to have more emphasis on being thin compared to maybe African American girls, but African American girls still can have eating disorders too, so just be aware of that. There are also personality factors, so if people are a little OCD or perfectionistic, they may be more prone to eating disorders. Lifestyle choices can, like for example, if someone is very obsessed about their health, it can also create eating disorders as well. On the other hand, flip side, if you don't live a healthy life, then that can also maybe contribute to obesity or something like that. And next thing is biology. An understanding of biology helps us understand that eating disorders tend to run in families. There are genetic influences in eating disorders. If our parents have eating disorders, we're more likely to have it as well. So there is a genetic component as well. And lastly, hormones. Hormones play a role in the sense that if someone has too much, if they have a hyperthyroid or hypothyroid, that means their metabolism rate may be too high or too low. So if you have a hyperthyroid, then you may end up having low body weight. Whereas many people have hypothyroidism, which means they end up having difficulty maintaining the weight because their metabolism rate is really slow. So what happens is that they can try and diet, but at the moment they eat something, they gain weight. And one of the ways to counteract this and affect the metabolism rate is through exercise. Exercise can actually help because it helps keep the metabolism rate boosted. Okay, so we talked about puberty. The timing of puberty can be very important for boys and girls, for both sexes. For boys, there is advantages and disadvantages with late maturation. On one hand, smaller. If you're late, you're smaller and less muscular than your peers, so that would be downside. Late maturing boys are often treated as younger children, they might be considered like they're still in middle school even though they're in high school. They may have lower social status among their peers, and they may be perceived as less competent by their adults because they're not big. And so oftentimes the tall ones and the ones who hit puberty earlier are the ones who develop these leadership skills because people assume that they're leader-like. On the other hand, there are some advantages to early maturation. There are disadvantages and advantages to both. Early maturation can lead to social and athletic advantages over peers. On the other hand, they may skip some valuable childhood skills that they need to learn. Maybe they need to learn to play and not be treated as adults just yet. Also, unfortunately, early maturation is associated with alcohol and substance abuse for boys. for girls, there's other things that we also have to look at. And also early maturation can also contribute to delinquency. So in some ways, we have to be teach teens to be content with where they're at, because, while early maturation may come with some advantages, it also comes with disadvantages, and the same thing with late maturation. For girls, there's disadvantages of early maturation as well. For early maturation, they may have fewer opportunities to discuss physical and emotional changes before it happens. So, for example, they may not be prepared as well for the changes in their body. Like they might have a period early on, and the parents hadn't quite prepared them for that, so they might freak out if they're not prepared for it. They're more likely to experience psychological distress because of early maturation. And it's also correlated with low self-esteem and other negative psychological effects. Now, dramatically early maturation may lead to missed valuable childhood psychological development because they're treated as adults when they're really, they're still children. They may also be pressured into early sexual behavior. That's another big one. Both sexes who mature early are sexually active at younger ages. So for both boys and girls, those who develop earlier tend to be sexually active more at a younger age. And that's because their bodies are showing, their reproductive years earlier. And so boys may be attracted more to the girls who have developing breasts, and vice versa. Girls are going to be attracted to the boys who stand out because they're taller or whatever but that can lead to pressure to be sexually active earlier because they're considered higher value or whatever among their peers. And again, this can also lead to psychological stress, higher psychological stress, and deviant behavior and delinquency, like it was for boys. So that leads us to the subject of sex. Now, sexuality is an important aspect of all cultures, and it's especially important in adolescence, because adolescence is a time when adolescents are developing their sexuality. They're discovering their sexual identity, and they're exploring their sexual desires and their behaviors. So there's elaborate rituals and strict social expectations that govern adolescent sexual behavior. And that's just to kind of help keep it in control. However, there have been dramatic changes in how the United States reacts to sexual behavior in the last 50 years. So, and there's been the sexual revolution, which we're going to look at next. So in the 1950s and 1960s, before the sexual revolution, premarital sex was viewed as immoral. However, starting in the mid-1960s, there was a change. Now, before the mid-1960s, attitudes in the United States about sexuality was very restrictive, more restrictive than it is today. And people would have what is known as a sexual double standard that existed, where sexual activity was viewed as more permissible for boys than for girls. However, starting in the late 1960s and the 1970s, sexual attitudes and behaviors became much more liberal, especially for girls. So during this, in the 1970s, they had the idea of free love, make love, not war, is a common slogan in reaction to the wars that were going on. And this is the first time adolescents did not view premarital sex as inherently wrong, right or wrong. It was just considered neutral. And they also rejected the sexual double standard that said it was okay for boys to be sexual but not for girls. Also, during this decade, attitudes about same-sex orientation, which involves attraction to members of one's own sex or engagement in same-sex activity, became somewhat more tolerant. So about 50% of people during this era approved of same-sex marriage. So there's an increase in sexual liberation, and the society at large became more accepting of a wide range of sexual behaviors. Now, in the 1980s, the sexual revolution was winding down, mainly because of the epidemic of the AIDS epidemic, and that was largely blamed on the sexual revolution. And there was also an increasing number of pregnancies. And so by the 1980s, the sexual revolution was winding down and beginning to fade. And social views about sexuality became much more conservative as young people became more cautious about sex. And so, although it never has quite returned to the pre-1960s level, we're still much more liberal today about sexuality than we were back in the 1950s, but not as liberal as it was in the 70s during the sexual revolution. And there has been more of unfavorable views about casual sex. Although I have to say, in the last 10 years, there has been an increase in the hookup culture. Although there's some debate about whether that's real or not. But the idea of the hookup culture is that, because of the internet and dating apps, there's been increased tendency for young people to engage in casual sex. But in general, there's more a conservative view than during the sexual revolution. Attitudes, and during the 1980s, attitudes towards same-sex orientation became more negative. That's another thing. There was a time shortly before recently, in which same-sex marriage was considered wasn't considered normal, and in fact, I remember in California, California was one of the most liberal states in the United States, but they voted for Proposition 8, which defined marriage in a traditional sense. It was only because of, I think it was a federal judge or a federal court, that overturned it, or I believe it was the California State Supreme Court, I believe, that overturned it. But anyway, the point is that it was a supposedly liberal state, and yet they were against same-sex marriage. So sexual values were generally more conservative, and they tended to be more stable in the 1990s. It wasn't until more recently, in the last late 2010s, in which these during the Obama administration, President Obama, in which same-sex marriage became normalized. And otherwise, youth have become more sexually conservative than their parents up until that point. And so there's probably some debate about whether that conservativeness is continuing or not. So we've had, from the 1990s to the present, sexual values have largely stabilized, although there are wide variations among individuals, families, religions, and cultures about what constitutes appropriate sexual behavior. So attitudes about homosexuality are becoming more accepting, and there are still more conservative ideas about teenage sexuality, but today the percentage of sexually active teenagers is approximately equal between the sexes, so there's no more of that double standard anymore. And the age of first intercourse is getting older, particularly among boys. So that's good, because we're teaching people to wait until they're more mature. And so that's a good thing. It's more conservative than it used to be. However, we don't want to return to shaming about sexuality. I think that's a concern that a lot of people have. We don't want to shame sexuality. We just think people need to be wise about it, especially with regards to pregnancy and STDs and stuff like that. Okay, so here's a chart that illustrates how high school students, or when high school students engage in sexual intercourse. So this is taken in 2013, and you can see throughout high school that it increases the percentage of high school students who've had sexual intercourse. So in 2013, a little less than 1/3 of ninth graders had engaged in sexual intercourse, but almost 2/3 of high school seniors had engaged in sex. And so you can see that by the time they graduate, about 2/3 of high schoolers will have had sex. But that's not 100%. You have to keep in mind, there's still a lot of people who are not doing it. But nevertheless, teenagers today continue to be highly sexually active. As I said, 2/3 of white 12th graders have had sexual intercourse. And Black and Hispanic teens tend to be sexually active earlier than white teens. Early sexual activity, and the reason why we talk about this is because early sexual activity is associated with adolescents who are raised in single parent families and families who communicate poorly. It's also attributed, or it's also associated with early maturation, so early puberty. And with, unfortunately, here's the downside, it's often associated with lower academic achievement. So people who are engaged in sex are not focused on school like they need to. And so that's kind of a problem. Ethnicity can also play a role in the sense that different racial or ethnic groups have emphasis on sex differently. As I said, Black and Hispanic teens tend to be engaged in sex earlier than white teens. Later sexual activity is associated with later maturation. So, teens who develop puberty later they tend to be engaged in sex later as well. But the advantage is that they tend to have higher academic achievement. Now, you might think of it as, oh, these are the nerds. But in some ways, that's actually good because people who mature later are going to maintain their youth longer, and they're going to not. I mean, teens who develop earlier tend to be shorter than those who develop later. The earlier you start with puberty, the earlier it's over, basically. And high academic achievement is a good thing because we want teens to be successful in life. And if they're focused on relationships, and that takes away from the skills that they need to learn, that's going to develop them into becoming adults and becoming responsible in life. So we're talking about adolescent sexual behavior, and we want to look at some of the risks and consequences of sexual activity. So we're going to look at STIs, or sexually transmitted infections, as well as unplanned pregnancies. So in the United States, about 20% of sexually active United States teenagers have an STI. That's 1 in 5. 1 in 5 American teenagers has a sexually transmitted infection. And that's pretty sad considering how they could be prevented through, either through practicing safe sex or using contraceptions, or being careful about the partners you're with. And about 19 million new cases of STIs are diagnosed each year in the United States. Nearly half of these, so pretty much half of the new cases of STIs involve adolescents. So that's pretty scary if you think about it. Half of all new sexually transmitted infections are involving adolescents. And it's estimated about 20%, like I said, a fifth, 1 in 5 teenagers has an STI. The most common STIs are genital herpes and chlamydia, both of which affect more women than men. Oftentimes, men may not even not experience symptoms, but they may be spreading it around to multiple women. Another important sexually transmitted infection is HIV or AIDS. Among adolescents, like I said, the most common STIs are genital herpes or chlamydia. However, rates of HIV infection are rising. And so HIV can be, thankfully today, because of new powerful antiretroviral drugs, HIV can be treated and it can reduce the amount of the virus in the body. However, AIDS cannot be cured. Once you've contracted it, it cannot be cured. About 2 to 3% of those living with AIDS in the United States are between the ages of 13 and 24. So that is the autoimmune deficiency. So once you've developed it, that's not a good thing. And so if they're developing early in life, that means they're going to be living with that for the rest of their lives. And so 2 to 3% of them are basically teenagers. The estimate may even be low due to the length of time between the infection and the onset of symptoms. So again, HIV is the viral infection. AIDS is the consequence of that develops into autoimmune problems. And so, you can treat the HIV infection, but we cannot treat the AIDS. You can only treat the virus, essentially. And so once you've got it, you can't get rid of it. You can just try to reduce the symptoms. Now, at the estimate may, like I said, the estimates may be low because it may take a long time. In fact, it can be a long time between the time you get the infection and the time you get the symptoms of AIDS. In 2014, youth aged 13 to 24 accounted for 22% of all new diagnoses in the United States for AIDS, I believe. Teenagers frequently are unaware, or they're aware of the risk, but they do not take the proper precautions. And that's because teenagers think that they are immune to a lot of things. They're likely to engage in risky behavior because they think that somehow they're going to be immune to it, that it won't happen to them. That's basically the mindset of a typical teenager. In 2018, health officials in Montgomery County, Maryland, are calling the upward trend in chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis cases a public health crisis. And I'm talking about this because this is the area where our university is at. And also the same thing in Washington, D.C. It's also a public health crisis in D.C. as well. But this is after levels of infection have reached the highest in a decade and are especially high among adolescents and emerging adults. So officials pretty much want to make condoms freely available to high school students just to reduce the rates of sexually transmitted infections. About 2.2% of girls between the ages of 15 and 19 gave birth in 2015. Their pregnancy rate is somewhat higher when accounting for abortion and miscarriage. A little more than half of teenagers who become pregnant will give birth, and that's because of probably due to abortions and miscarriage. So about 2 to 3% of teenagers become pregnant. Teenage girls become pregnant, and half of them will give birth. So 26% of these pregnancies are lost through abortion, and 20% are lost due to miscarriage. So that's about half of them, basically, almost half, are lost due to abortion or miscarriage. And the other half, they give birth. So the pregnancy rates they vary dramatically by racial or ethnic backgrounds and are higher for Black and Hispanic teenagers. So that's why some people they talk about making, these family planning methods or abortion available because of how it affects teenagers from different ethnicities differently. However, pregnancy rates for adolescents have fallen sharply over the past 3 decades, especially among Black and Hispanic teens. If you look at the chart here, you can see how the pregnancies have dropped a lot since the 1980s. And so this is the fertility rates. So really to understand teen pregnancies, it's important to understand the cultural forces. So we're looking at how this has changed. This doesn't mean that this is fertility rates in like births per 1,000. So it's so about 15 to 17-year-old women. So as you can see how it's has dropped off dramatically, and pregnancy rates, like I said, they've fallen sharply. If you notice among Black and Hispanic girls, has dropped dramatically. U.S. adolescents are less likely to use contraception than teenagers in Western European nations, and it may be due to the taboo about teenage sexuality. In the United States, 22% of adolescent girls and 15% of adolescent boys did not use contraception during their first sexual intercourse. So that means boys are more likely to use contraception than girls. That is, at least according to the statistic. Now, I can't remember if that matches my other research that I've seen, but it really just shows that both boys and girls need to take responsibility for the use of contraceptions. Now, people argue that boys can impregnate more girls at a time, but the reality is that both boys and girls need to be responsible for the use of contraception. Girls can ask for it, and boys should also know that they need to take responsibility for that as well. The rate of teen pregnancy, like I said, has been declining since 1992. Teens today are more likely to use condoms, and that's probably due to, the increased sex education programs in high school. There used to be a lot of emphasis on abstinence, but the downside about that, when we talk a lot about abstinence, is that we tend not to talk about the importance of contraception. And so the people just think, okay, I'm going to be abstinent, but then they're not prepared for when they actually do have sex. So that's why it's important to talk about both. Broad-based education programs help adolescents to think through the consequences of early parenting. And culture is an important determinant to proper sexual behavior. So some cultures, they are better at encouraging teens to wait than other cultures. So it's important to look at the role of that as well. So why is it important? Having a child at an early age can have some damaging consequences. It can be very damaging economically, and in the United States, becoming a teenage mother often is associated with difficult economic circumstances and personal challenges. Teenage parents are often stressed, frustrated, inexperienced in raising a child, and economically challenged. Their success at nurturing their children depends on the individual parent, on the available resources, on their resilience, and on the skills that they bring to parenting. Unfortunately, teenage parents may be forced to drop out of school. Like if they have, I've seen even in college, I've had students get pregnant, and it's really hard for them to continue on with school because they got a baby now that they have to take care of. And teenage parents who marry as a response to pregnancy, unfortunately, are more likely to experience conflict and divorce. We call those the shotgun weddings. It's because there's cultural pressure for people to get married when they are pregnant. But unfortunately, oftentimes it's a recipe for disaster because they weren't meant to be together to begin with. They just happen to have a baby. Adolescent parents must deal with their own development then while also adapting to the needs of a child. They're still growing and they're still maturing, and now they also have to take care of a child as well. And so many of them are not quite ready to be parents. They're not mature enough because they're still thinking about their own needs in life. Okay, so early marriage under such circumstances generally does not produce positive outcomes, in part because it often leads to dropping out of school. So they're disadvantaged compared to children of older parents. And young parents are more likely to neglect or abuse their own children, mainly because of the stress that they have, and mainly due to all the stress that they have. They may also be more likely to exhibit slow development or cognitive growth of their own. And some teenage parents raise well-developed emotionally and physically healthy children. So we don't want to make it sound like it's just doom and gloom either. There's lots of children of teenage parents who turn out fine, but they're just going to have a lot of challenges on the way. So they just need a lot of support. We don't want to judge them. We just need to support them. So adolescence is a time also of dramatic changes in the brain. We've talked about sexuality, but now we're going to talk about cognitive development. And these changes can play an important role in forming mature judgments and decision-making skills. In this time period, a second wave of neural pruning and synapse development occurs. They have a decrease in gray matter in the brain, an increase in white matter. And so this is a second wave of neural pruning, a time when pruning and myelination, they don't occur uniformly across the brain, but they do occur. The cerebellum continues to grow throughout adolescence. The brain development in adolescence begins first in the back of the brain in the regions that are responsible for sensory functions, and then proceeds toward the front to the prefrontal cortex, where decision-making, problem-solving, and thoughts occur. So cognitive skills involving judgment and self-concept are among the last to develop. That's really key to know because, adolescents oftentimes have the automatic skills down. They know how to do their kinesthetic skills. They're good with their coordination. They're good. They have good motor skills. They can drive fast. They can run fast, but they don't necessarily have good judgment to go with it. So they may oftentimes engage in risky behavior that their brain hasn't quite figured out yet. They don't understand the risks involved. So, they may get themselves into trouble. So hormones that are produced during puberty affect the brain development, especially in the amygdala where emotions are regarded. So that's why risky behavior and emotional outbursts may result from the pace at which different areas of the brain develop throughout adolescence. So, those areas that are related to emotional regulation and control tend to be slower in developing. So hormones affect the brain development, and so due to this difference in the pace, the risk, they might have risky behavior. So dopamine, they might have dopamine overactivity, and both the amygdala and the dopamine are responsible for increases in risk-taking activity. And there's an expansion in the capacity and style of thought. Now here, let's talk about metacognition, okay? So let's go to that. Metacognition is also increases during adolescence. So that's especially due to the development of the cortex. So cognitive development in adolescence centers on acquiring more knowledge and an increasing ability to use abstract thought and metacognition, metacognition is really thinking about thinking. So that's something that develops in this time period. But another thing that also develops is the stage of formal operations. As you may recall, Jean Piaget noted that about age 12, adolescents reach the stage of formal operations when they're able to reason hypothetically and think about abstract thoughts. And so they have abstract, speculative, and independent, and their thinking is independent of their immediate environment and circumstances. They're able to think about possibilities. They're able to think about their own thinking. They're able to compare reality with what might or might not be. And all of this requires the ability to formulate, test, and evaluate hypotheses. So this is what is called hypothetical thinking, logical. And so one of the hallmarks of formal operations is this logical and systematic hypothesis testing. That's a hallmark of formal operations. And adolescents also show an increasing ability to plan and think ahead. So let's look at some of these views. We're going to talk more in detail about this. So according to Piaget, this development of thought processes allow for more complex and flexible thinking during formal operations. So again, his stage associated with adolescence is known as formal operations. And so this is a time when they have more abstract thinking. So this is a development of increasingly effective strategies for thought. And theorists who emphasize information processing skills see the changes associated with this transition from childhood to adolescent thinking as gradual. So cognitive development is continuous. But adolescents also have second order thought, which means they can maneuver between reality and the possibilities, as well as look for relationships or links between relationships. And so formal thought is more predominant among individuals with higher levels of education or who work complex jobs. So this is a higher level of thinking, but not everybody is thought to enter into this. And according to Piaget, cognitive advances are typically associated with entering adolescence. So here again, these are associated with adolescence. The ability to consider abstract ideas. And then here's the word I would like you to remember. This phrase, hypothetical deductive reasoning. That's basically the idea of logical and systematic hypothesis testing. It's like scientific reasoning. Adolescents are able to think scientifically. They can create a hypothesis, and then they can test it and deduce to see if that hypothesis is correct. They also have the ability to think about several aspects of a problem, so they no longer have centration. They're able to consider multiple issues at a time. They have better memory and more knowledge. They also have the ability to use more complex and more efficient strategies for storing and retrieving information. So they have their memory processes are more advanced. They have more mature approach to planning and decision making, so they're able to plan ahead. And they also can reflect on their own thinking. That's metacognition, meaning the ability to think about one's thinking. Okay, so let's talk about the scope and content of adolescent thought. Adolescents tend to develop a broader scope and richer complexity in their contents of thoughts. They're more interested in science or math. That's because of the formal operations period. So they're able to think logically. And the experimentation with different ways of thinking emerges during this stage of development. So in adolescence, as adolescents acquire improved cognitive skills, they often develop new interests. And unfortunately, their parent-child relationships sometimes suffer as adolescents become more critical of their parents. So they start to realize what an ideal parent is and what their real parents are. So they become very critical. They have this newfound ability to understand contrary to fact situations that often affect their relationship with their parents. So they understand, wait a minute, this is not the way it should be. So they become critical of their family as well as social institutions. And they have their battles with parents allow the teenagers to test their independence. And they may negotiate a new relationship with their parents. Now, just so you know, this tends to be conflict among teenagers tends to be a Western phenomenon, especially in individualistic cultures. In cultures that emphasize collectivistic values, teenagers are taught to stuff it. Basically, they're taught to obey their parents and to be more harmonious. They don't tend to have the same kind of conflict that we do in the United States. But in general, the egocentrism. Now, children are always somewhat egocentric, right? Adolescents are somewhat egocentric too, and their egocentrism emerges again compared to like maybe middle childhood. But the difference here is that their focus is on developing their sense of identity. Whereas before, early childhood egocentrism is simply just due to naivety about the world. Adolescents are egocentric mainly because they are learning about themselves. So this is a normal part of their cognitive development. And so they tend to have an absorption in their own thoughts, which leads to this adolescent egocentrism. The idea that David Elkind introduces this concept of the imaginary audience, and this concept of imaginary audience refers to adolescents' tendency to see themselves as a center of everyone's scrutiny, assuming that others are focusing a great deal of attention on them. I've had friends who were young, adolescents or early emergent adults, and they have this idea that think everybody's focusing on them. When the reality is everybody's in their own world. They're caring about their own stuff. They don't need to worry about you, But they tend to think everybody's out there criticizing them. And they tend to also be absorbed in their own feelings, focusing on their own drama, and they don't tend to care so much about other people. So adolescents are very sensitive to their own minor imperfections, to criticisms, and to the major invasions of their privacy. Now, some adolescents develop a personal fable, which is the belief that they are so special that they should be exempt from the laws of nature, and that they are invulnerable and that nothing bad can happen to them, and that they will live forever. Research suggests, though, that this egocentric thinking may actually extend well into emergent adulthood, and this tends to be what distinguishes people in their 20s and 30s. As I've always said, people in their 20s think they're going to live forever. And it's those in their 30s who realize, nope, we're not going to live forever, and they start to care more about their health when it's too late, unfortunately. So teenagers, they're more likely to abuse their bodies when they're in the prime of their health, sadly. They're more likely to abuse their health because they think that they're immune to things. And so this imaginary audience and the personal fable characterize adolescent thinking. So as we've said earlier, adolescent decision-making is characterized by a higher level of risk-taking than occurs in early childhood or adulthood. They know enough to get themselves into trouble. They have logical skills, but they don't have the intuition or judgment that comes from experience. So they got the skills, but they don't have the wisdom, and that's important. So they may make cold decisions, relying on analytical reasoning that underlies a formal operational thought. And cold decision processes guide a good share of our behavior, but they don't have the hot decision processes that rely on intuition and sometimes involve emotional regulation. Both of these are important. So risky behavior is long identified with adolescents. They're able to think critically, but they don't always think wisely, and have intuition. There's a study that looked at it's called the Iowa Gambling Task Study, I guess. It was developed to measure cognitive developments among brain-injured individuals who had good cognitive function but lacked the ability to make good decisions. And so the IGT, the Iowa Gambling Task, is a card game that involves gambling. And so they found, as a result of this study, that adolescents... so here's the thing. 2 decks are rigged so the rewards are high, but the losses are higher. So 2 decks offer smaller winnings, but they have a higher probability that winning exceeds losing. So upon learning which deck offers the best chances of winning, adults choose the less risky decks, right? But however, adolescents will always continue choosing the riskier cards, meaning that, they have higher rewards, but their losses are higher. So the adolescents are more likely to engage in risky gambling, because they think they're going to go for the rewards. They think that somehow they're going to win it, even though the risks are higher. Adults tend to go with safer bets, basically smaller winnings, but they have a lower chance of losing or a higher chance of winning. So adolescents are more likely to think risky. Now, adolescents also start to consider the broader issues that will define their adult years. So they start to develop their sense of morality. They have the ability to reason through their choices, both good and bad, which is instrumental to their behavior. Some decisions have complex, life-threatening consequences, like if they engage in drinking and driving. Some adolescents may not develop the moral framework and cognitive skills they need until they're well into adolescence or even early adulthood. So that's a normal, unfortunately, a sad part of our development. Sometimes adolescents don't develop their moral reason early enough, and they can actually engage in behaviors that can be harmful to themselves and others. Most adolescents can move beyond Kohlberg's conventional stage, at least occasionally, where judgment conforms to social expectations and stereotypes. Because remember, adolescents are all about conformity. When adolescents are able to make moral choices that do not conform to social standards, but rely on internalized moral principles, they are exhibiting post-conventional moral reasoning. So some are able to engage in that, but may not be quite there yet. All right, and so higher levels of moral thought can be taught, though, and moral reasoning can be advanced by giving adolescents practice in solving increasingly complex moral dilemmas. So that's what we found. Moral decisions are rarely simple, but adolescents can learn to weigh the various perspectives as they determine their thoughts and actions. And that's it for Chapter 10. Just take a quick review at some of the things we've covered. We've talked about adolescent development in a cultural and historical context. We've looked at some of the physical changes in the body, such as growth spurt, sexual, reproductive changes. And we've also talked about body image and how it affects our development and eating disorders. We've also talked about the changes in attitudes towards sex among teenagers. And we've also talked about adolescent sexual behavior and the risk for pregnancies and STIs and the use of contraceptives. And lastly, we talked about cognitive development, or second to last, we talked about cognitive changes in adolescent development. We've looked at how the brain is increasingly, has the ability to engage in formal operations, and they have increasingly complex cognitive skills, and yet they don't have the judgment necessarily. They're still thinking about themselves in the sense that they have an imaginary audience. They think everybody's focused on them, and they have a personal fable, thinking that they are special and invulnerable, which makes them at more risk for risky behavior, like drinking and driving, or engaging in sex without protection, that sort of thing. But adolescents, they can and should be taught to think beyond what other people expect of them. They have to be taught to internalize moral principles for themselves. And that's it. Join us for chapter 11 as we continue on discussion about adolescence. Thank you.